Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this lovely lecture theatre for a lovely lecture by an amazing lecturer. I'm Roger Kirby. I'm the current president of the Royal Society of Medicine. You're most welcome, everybody. It's lovely to see this hall filled, actually, over the last 2.5 years of COVID. You know, we've been difficult to get people in, but tonight we're absolutely packed because we've got such a great speaker. Well, this is the Jephcott Lecture, and the Jephcott family are with us tonight, the 4th baronet of the Jephcott family is with us in the front. David, Sir David, thank you very much for coming, with Fiona sitting next to him. So thank you so much to the family. Sir Harry Jephcott, a lot of you will know, is an extremely famous individual. He came from ordinary beginnings. His father was a train driver in Redditch in Worcester, I read, but he had the bright idea of founding a pharmaceutical company. And by 1995, Glaxo had become the largest pharmaceutical company in the world. So Sir Harry decided wisely that he would donate some money to the Royal Society of Medicine. Anybody in the audience would like to do the same? All donations gratefully received. So he donated quite a large sum of money, and we've been having a Jephcott Lecture almost every year since 1959. We've had some very famous speakers. The first one was Sir Alexander Todd, who actually worked with my father. My father was a cancer researcher, and Sir Alexander Todd came here on the very first lecture in 1959 to talk about DNA and its implications in terms of cancer. That was after the exciting years of Watson and Crick and so on. Well, we had Sir Richard Sykes here, who I work with now at King Edward VII Hospital, chairman of Glaxo, and there are Glaxo connections that I'll come on to. This evening we've had Dame Sally Davis, we had Sir Michael Rawlins, a famous pharmacologist and the first chairman of NICE, which our Dean, Jill Leng, here in the front row, was involved with for many years. So sadly, we were at Sir Mike Rawlins' funeral just 3 or 4 weeks ago up in Northumberland. Wonderful man. And last year we had Sir John Cunningham, the physician to the royal household, which is always a very good position to hold. Well, Sir Patrick Vallance really doesn't need much of an introduction, but I'll just tell you a few things about him. He is, of course, the chief scientific advisor. From 1986 to 1995, he was at St George's Hospital, where I was a consultant actually for 10 years, just after that, working with a quite unusual clinician called Joe Collier that I remember extremely well. And the two of them together discovered that nitric oxide was important in relaxing blood vessels, and one of the important discoveries in terms of hypertension. He then became professor at University College London, not far from here, and in 2006 he joined Glaxo with the drug discovery team. And in 2018 he joined the government, and what should come along 2 years later but COVID-19. And that's why he's so famous now, because he's appeared on the same podium as Boris Johnson, Matt Hancock, and Chris Whitty. And he has become a sort of television star as a result of it. The only thing he hasn't done yet is appeared in I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, where he might be asked to eat some portion of a kangaroo that he'd rather not. So on, with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sir Patrick. He's going to talk for roughly 50 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes of questions. And we hope that all those questions none of those questions will be controversial, because we want to keep, this is being recorded, and we want to be able to put everything on the website afterwards. So with no further ado, Sir Patrick Vallance, a round of applause, please.
Well, good evening. Thanks very much. I'm going to talk about science matters. I'm going to talk some matters of science and why science matters. And it's a great pleasure to give this Jephcott Lecture. And as has already been said, Harry Jephcott was important in the UK because he was an entrepreneur. He actually took a very small organisation and realised that he could make it into a very important global organisation. and his work on setting up the company, driving it to that success, and actually penicillin during the Second World War, when he was instrumental in working out how you could manufacture penicillin, and that became really the stimulus for Glaxo becoming very big. But he wasn't just in industry, he was actually also on the Advisory Council for Scientific Policy from 1953 to 1956. And so it's a pleasure to be giving this talk in his name. Let me start with just asking the question, where does science matter? And I challenge you to think of a single area of policy or operations where science, engineering, innovation wouldn't make a difference. And science is clearly important for everything from how we think about our food supply to how we think about digital design of cities through to heating and insulation of houses, the energy supply for the UK, of course, health, how we communicate with each other, how we move around the country, and how that's going to change with autonomous vehicles. It's important in every single department. It's not only important for everyday activities in every department, but it's important for defence of the nation, for national security, and for resilience. And the picture in the bottom middle there is the Toddbrook Dam, which you'll remember was close to collapsing a few years ago, a year or so when I was into this role. So science becomes relevant in all of these aspects. And it's not just that it's important for policy and operations, but science is crucial for the economy. And if you look across the world and ask which are the top companies, the biggest companies in the world, and which are the fastest growing companies in the world, the answer is that 7 out of the 10 top companies globally are science and tech companies. They tend to grow faster than other companies, albeit, of course, with some volatility. What's more, we know that companies that invest in R&D do better than companies that don't, and the same's true at a national level. So this is a graph from the OECD showing labour productivity against R&D spend as a percentage of GDP, and you can see there is a positive correlation. The more you spend on R&D, the higher your productivity. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean it's causality, but it probably is causality if you look at all of the evidence. One little anomaly you'll notice, the United Kingdom is on there twice, and that's because the Office for National Statistics recently updated their assessment of what percentage we spend on R&D from 1.6 up to just over 2. So if it's so important right the way across government, if it's important for policy operations, for resilience, for defence, for security, for the economy, you'd sort of hope government was good at it. You'd like to think that government actually was scientifically enabled. And before I took up this role 5 years ago, I had lunch with Gus O'Donnell, a previous cabinet secretary, and I asked him what he thought of science in government. And he said, well, it's good in parts, and it comes to the fore at certain times, but it's not embedded. It's not as integrated into the way government works as, for example, economics is. And he said, but if you go back 40 years or so, economics wasn't embedded in government. It had to happen, it had to be done. So his advice to me was, try to make sure that science engineering become as integral to government work as economics has become. And a few years on, things are in a better place. We undertook a piece of work to try and find out what it looked like 5 years ago, and that was a document that we wrote together with Treasury, asking the question, what is the state of play of science in government? And that was 2018, published in 2019. We found that science budgets had been disproportionately reduced compared to other departmental budgets. The departments didn't really have a consistent model of what they wanted to do with science. So some of them would say, well, we've got some scientists and we call on them when we need them. That's not how you get science embedded in the system. They have to be there at the table at all discussions in order to be able to see where science or engineering could play a part. We found that resources had grown weak and that several of the public sector research establishments, so the publicly funded research bodies linked to departments, had become weakened. Not all of them, some of them are outstanding, but some of them have become weakened over several decades and had different models. We also found that if you ask the question, what percentage of your total spend do you spend on R&D, in some departments the answer was a fraction of 1%. Well, if you were a company and you said, I'm going to spend a fraction of 1% on R&D, you have declared yourself to be no growth and a commodity rather than a growth company trying to innovate. Perhaps even more striking, we asked the question, of all the people on the FAST stream, so this is the graduate intake stream for the civil service, and most of the sort of future senior leaders of the civil service come in through this scheme, what proportion of them had a science degree or a STEM degree of any sort? And from the generalist FAST stream, we found out that the answer was roughly 10%. Now, I don't know what the right answer is, but it's not 10%. It's not 90% either. I mean, it's very important that you have a mix of people, but over many, many years, it had become normal for the vast majority of graduates on the scheme to come from arts and humanities background rather than from science backgrounds. Now, again, it's important that those people are in the civil service, but there needs to be a rebalancing. And we found that of the specialist FAST stream, there were only 24 specialist science and engineering FAST streamers out of the entire civil service. Things have improved. Much of the recommendations that we put in the document have been met or are on the way to being met. So we've got now every department has a chief scientific advisor. Every department has a structure around those individuals so that they can actually perform in more than just a single lone operator capacity. Budgets for departmental science have increased. The science and engineering FAST stream has increased threefold over that period, and there is now a target to have 50% of general FAST stream with a STEM degree. It's also the case that documents are beginning to reflect this. So the integrated review, which was first published 2 years ago, I think, Global Britain in a Competitive Age, which was to define the position of the UK in a changing world and its foreign policy, had an entire chapter on science and technology, and science and technology was woven through every single chapter. That's recently been refreshed as a document, and that remains the case, that science and technology is central to our vision of ourselves as a global nation. And it's important because it talks about strategic advantage through science and technology. Government reform is, of course, about reforming all aspects of the civil service, but it says we will champion innovation and harness science, engineering, and technology to improve policy and services. So if I sort of summarize where I think things are in government, I would say science and engineering is in a better place. There is a pull for it. Senior civil servants definitely now value it and know how to use it. And there's an increasing number of people who are expert in this across government. So it's headed in the right direction. There's still more to do, and there's a lot to do around all sorts of aspects, including the public sector research establishments, to make sure they get the right support to be as effective as they can be. But having science in government, of course, is not enough. It's necessary, and indeed, if you look across the world, you'll see that governments are worrying about this right the way across the world, and some governments have gone a long way towards trying to make their governments more enabled with science, technology, and engineering. Others are just starting. It's also important that you have an effective academic or foundational science base, so research institutes, charitable funding research institutes, and, of course, the universities. And here, I think we can say that the UK is good. We have less than 1% of the world's population, but 4% of the world's researchers. We have 14% of the world's most highly cited publications come from the UK. 3 or 4 out of the top 10 universities in the world are based in the UK. The research funding organisations have been brought together under UKRI with a significant increase of budget. So there's lots that looks very good there, and that long heritage of high-quality academic research is really important because you can't invent that overnight. It's something that has to build. But it's also true, it's not something you can take for granted. It isn't something that we can say it's always going to be like that, where we're number 1, 2, 3 in the world, depending on how you want to look at it. We're definitely up in that top bracket. But without proper funding, without really concentrating on what this means, this can fade away. And if we slip down that, it's very difficult to get back up again. So the maintenance of strong funding for foundational science is important. And that goes right the way back to 1918. So Haldane was the person who really first focused on this in government. And one of the principles that he put in place was that decisions about which research projects should be funded should be made through independent evaluation by experts based on the quality and likely impact of their research. So this led to the formation of research councils where there was peer review and it was projects being judged by scientists. But he also made an important distinction between what he called specific research and general research. So specific research was the things that departments need in order to do their business, and general research were the things that scientists outside government wanted to do because they were curious. And that distinction remains important. We need good funding of both applied research and specific research, things that government needs answers to. And we absolutely need very strong funding of general research. That curiosity-driven research from which things happen which you'd never have expected, that drive some of the important developments of the future. And as part of doing that, it's important to look at what the mechanisms are to fund science. What is it that allows people to be successful? And I've already mentioned the formation of UKRI as an important attempt to try and bring together disciplines across different research councils to try to make multidisciplinary research easier because it's not fragmented into individual research councils always. You can do things across. And the latest one is also the funding of the Advanced Research and Invention Agency. And this is modeled on the US system, the DARPA system, or the ARPA system initially, which was about trying to take a series of big, difficult problems and ask, could you bring together a series of researchers and fund them to try and tackle this problem with a very clear goal-orientated approach? And the classic one, I think, from ARPA, the American model, was a long time ago when it was actually Treasury in the US who said, we're fed up with every department asking for a bigger and bigger computer every year. Can't you get these things to talk to each other? And that, of course, led to the ARPANET, which became the internet. So that's a sort of question that needs to go to ARPA. That sort of big, difficult question, but one that's potentially tractable if you've got the right people together. And this is just really getting off the ground now. And I think Paul Nurse wrote his report, which came out a couple of weeks ago, really arguing for more diversity in the funding system in order to make sure that we have different models in order to allow people to approach things in different ways, and that we minimize the bureaucracy. So if I summarize where I think things are in terms of the foundational science base, it's very good, but we can't rest on our laurels, and there's a danger it begins to slip if we don't do something to try and make sure that it stays right there. Other countries are improving, and we need to make sure that we remain attractive. Of course, we have lost things with the exclusion from the European programs, and I hope personally that we get back in those as soon as we possibly can, and that we remain open to researchers from around the world. But the third leg of the stool is industry. And when you look across the UK, we've got good big industries. We've got aerospace, we've got defense industries, we've got the pharmaceutical industry. If you look at the translation of science from universities into startups, we're doing pretty well, actually. There's now a very vibrant startup scene in a number of places in the UK, and we have more startups than any other country in Europe. And we have more startups that are actually growing. But what we still don't have is a very effective system to get those startups to grow into scalable companies. And we still tend to slightly undercapitalize the startups. So if you look at the number of venture deals into so-called deep tech companies, i.e. companies really working on the technologies themselves, and this is benchmarked against 2015, so 100 is the starting point for all of the countries, and that's the US, the UK, and the rest of Europe. You can see the number of deals looks pretty similar between those countries when it's normalized. If you look at the average size of the deal, the US is way ahead of others. So we still tend to slightly undercapitalize what's going on, and we don't necessarily have good mechanisms to grow those companies, and that's one of the things that is being looked at now, and a number of measures are being put in place to try and say what frees up the capital necessary to allow these things to grow, which could include, for example, pension funds being able to invest in those sorts of scale-up opportunities. So, government improving in terms of where its science is, academia very strong, we need to make sure it stays strong, and other research organizations strong. Industry, we've got growing opportunities in startups and some things to think about in terms of where that goes. So let me now move from process to actual what happens when you use this. And the place I want to start is COVID. So in early 2020, and for me, this started on January the 3rd, 2020, when I was away, and I sent a message back to the office saying, I think we need to think about calling some form of SAGE activity around COVID. Well, it wasn't called COVID then. It was a disease in Wuhan which was causing odd respiratory illnesses and clearly a lot of hospitalizations, even though we couldn't really tell exactly what was going on at that stage. So early in January 2020, we started to assemble the team. And if you think about those three categories, one of the things that was incredibly important for the UK during all of COVID was the ability to pull on a very strong foundational science base. It was possible quickly to get experts round the table from many, many disciplines. It was possible to get modelers around the table. It was possible to get experts in clinical trials working very fast. And by the way, clinical trials became an incredibly important part of what needed to happen. It wasn't just the fact that we had clinical trials to show what worked in COVID. It was also to have clinical trials which showed what didn't work. And it was also important that those people who were getting excited about trying out everything that sounded like it might work didn't win out. In other words, you can't move suddenly into a situation where you'll try anything. And the classic example for that was vitamin D, where there was a big groundswell of opinion. Why doesn't everyone give the entire population vitamin D? Well, the answer is because we don't know it works. And the most recent study, which did look at that properly, showed probably it didn't do anything. And so the ability to rely on accurate, reliable, well-designed, well-structured, well-sized clinical trials was incredibly important. And that was because the UK was good at it. And that ability actually to look at those sorts of trials in the NHS was particularly important. And if you look around the world during COVID, there were thousands of clinical trials. Most of them were too small to give an answer, and they gave bad answers or wrong answers. The recovery study set up by Martin Landry and Peter Horby in Oxford really did a good job of making sure it was properly designed and structured and sized to come up with real answers. And at the peak of the pandemic, I think there was something like 12% of all hospitalized patients in the UK were in that clinical trial. That's a remarkable number because mostly the percentage of patients with any disease in hospital and clinical trials is about 1%, even if you've got a very active trial program going on. So clinical trials, it was also important for things like sequencing and the ability to get genetic sequencing of the virus done in the UK through COG UK. It was set up early in February 2020, and for most of 2020, 50% of the viral genomes in the world were done by the teams in the UK. So access to a foundational science base was incredibly important, including, of course, for some of the building blocks of the vaccine work. What about companies? Well, companies clearly were also important. And if you look at the examples of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, we have a big pharmaceutical industry in the UK, and it was possible to do therapeutic studies quite quickly, as I've said, and to start thinking about making new medicines. Because there is a skilled workforce, when we wanted to set up a vaccines task force, it was possible to get people from industry into that quickly. And many people at the very beginning of that, when we set it up in early March, late February 2020, many people came from industry, and then I brought Kate Bingham in as well, who was fantastic and got this running from May in a sort of very structured way. But that's only possible if you've got an industry that has those skilled people. So the people become important as well as the companies and what they produce. And that ability to set up that vaccines team that could look across the world and see what was going on was totally dependent on the presence of an industry in the UK. Now, if you look at diagnostics, we don't actually have much of a diagnostics industry in the UK, or we didn't. It's getting better. And that was more difficult to scale because there wasn't the expertise. So that interaction is important, and that baseline skill set becomes incredibly valuable. And where does government fit into that? Well, government was important in this because of things like Public Health England that had to try and run the science in practical terms for public health. It was important for things like the Office for National Statistics, which was able to set up a trial that monitored the incidence and prevalence across the country. And that trial was only possible because a private company was also part of it. And when ONS was trying to set it up and didn't have the staff to do it, I remembered that the UK head of a company called IQVIA had said about 3 weeks before that his staff were twiddling their thumbs because clinical trials other than COVID had been stopped, and he had a skilled workforce and they were ready to go. And so I said, well, why don't you put them on the ONS study then? Why don't they go and do something different? And that's eventually what happened and led to the fact that we could do a study which around the world people were looking at it and saying, we don't have information like that. We don't know what's going on. And certainly we didn't know at the beginning of COVID. We did not have the data systems to know what was going on. So that ability for government to step in and to be part of helping forge a solution to come up with answers is where government science should play a role. And ultimately, government science becomes an integrator in this sort of situation, bringing together academia, industry, other parts in order to try and get some answers to the specific questions that it may have. And part of what was developed during COVID was the National Core Studies Programme, where disciplines came together from academia and industry to try and tackle problems such as, where is this virus transmitting? What might the very long-term effects be? How do we know to use data in a way to get the best answers? And those core studies were a new way of working, which I hope that we can hang on to post-COVID, because people who worked in them said, that's interesting, we're working in an interdisciplinary way that hasn't happened. The final example on COVID and government was one that surprised me, because at the end of this week, I finish as Government Chief Scientific Advisor, and I become the chair of the Natural History Museum. And I was walking around the Natural History Museum, and somebody said, would you like to come and see the bat collection? I said, well, I'll come and see the bat collection. So I went down to the bat collection, and the man there said, we've been thinking about whether we could add anything to what is known about COVID. And we realized that we could take a needle sample out of these bats, which have been collected from around the world and preserved for a very long time, and he found you could actually detect coronavirus in the bats. So he linked with his colleagues in other natural history museums around the world, and they're now doing a project to try and see if they can actually look at genomic evolution of coronavirus in different bats from around the world. So things surprise you, and I'm glad that we're able to get surprises like that. Now, that science base has been important through COVID, and it's crucial that we don't now slip back. We ended up getting the first answer about a drug that worked in COVID, which was dexamethasone, in about 136 days after the virus was identified. We got the first test for COVID about 67 days, but it took something like 240 days before that became a easy-to-use, population-based series of tests. And it took 307 days to get the first vaccine. So the question that we asked, and this came to the G7 in 2021, and it was a project that I led together with Melinda Gates, was what would happen if you did all that in 100 days? Within 100 days of identifying a virus, you would have vaccines ready to produce at scale, an initial regimen of therapeutics, and safe, reliable, approved diagnostics. The answer is hundreds of thousands of lives would have been saved. And so the question we put to the community and worked with the community on was, how do you think about doing that for any new infection? Is that possible? What would you need to do? And I'm not going to go into the recommendations, but there were 3 areas that we thought were important. First of all, you need to build an armamentarium of building blocks. And that means starting now on the high likelihood pathogen classes. The second is that when you do this, you need to then make the ways of working embedded in everyday practice. There's no point saying, well, we'll have distributed manufacturing facilities around the world, but by the way, we've got nothing to manufacture. It won't work. It has to be things that people use every day, just like clinical trials need to be in clinical practice in order to be then actionable when you have an emergency. And the third is the rules of the road should be sorted out in advance. Now is the time to sort out funding, legal things, transfer of data, IP considerations. You shouldn't be trying to work that out in a pandemic. So there are a series of recommendations which were picked up by the G7. And I think it's incredibly important that as political memories begin to fade on this, we don't allow that to become an underfunding which causes a problem for the next time this happens, and there will be another pandemic at some point. So the 100-day mission provides some blueprint across the world to try to get a way to make ourselves safer next time. The second example I want to give, moving away from COVID, is the other massive challenge that governments around the world face, and one that isn't going to go away after 2 or 3 years. And that, of course, is climate. And this is a graph that I particularly like from many scientists around the world. It shows the carbon dioxide concentration against time. And this is taken from ice cores from the Antarctic. So if you go right the way down in the ice, you get to very, very old ice. And they've gone back to 800,000 years. And they're now doing work to try to get to 1.2 million years ago. And in that ice, there is trapped air. And you can measure the carbon dioxide content of air from 800,000 years ago. And what you can see is that the carbon dioxide content has gone up and down over time, and you can see ice ages pulled out there, and you can see periods where the world was warmer. And then you get to the far right-hand side, and it goes off the scale. So where it says today is literally where the figure is today. So it's not a little bit higher, it is dramatically higher. And the thing that's different is the Industrial Revolution. So this is a slide which has had a lot of impact to people, and if you look at temperature, you can track temperatures against carbon dioxide concentration. It's very clear that we have a major global problem that's going to tax all of us over many, many years. So where do our 3 areas of academia, industry and government now come into play? Well, first of all, academics have been instrumental in making people aware of this across the world. They discovered what was happening. They discovered that the temperature was changing. They discovered this change in carbon dioxide concentration. They're looking at everything from changes on sea level through to specific effects relating to biodiversity across the world. So the academic work is absolutely crucial and now needs to focus on the things that are beyond just showing that this is happening. Needs to focus on what are the effects on the things that are going to affect life now. What are the adaptation needs that we might need to make? How can we learn from natural solutions, nature-based solutions for this? How can we also learn from indigenous people and how they're coping with this and some of the things that have been tried for years? How do we do the research that allows new technologies to come online and to make sure that governments are enabled not only to watch this happening, but to actually do something about it? And that requires both scientists and engineers. And I'll come back to engineers in just a minute. There are some problems that we simply don't understand. We can't do sub-kilometre scale climate forecasting, but you could. There are ways to do it, and that will become incredibly important for knowing what's happening locally and what effect that might have on different areas of the world. There are some strange things that we don't understand well, like clouds aren't really very well understood and the impact of clouds. So there's lots more work to be done in the academic world, and there's an enormous amount to be done in the industrial world. If you take 2050 as your endpoint and say, I would like to make sure that by 2050 we are at net zero, it's going to take 20 years to scale the technology you need, because you've got to get it into every house or every business or every part of industry. That doesn't happen overnight. That's a big scaling problem. So let's say it takes 20 years. That means 2030, you need to know which technologies you want to run with. That means if you think you're going to discover something that hasn't yet been discovered, some brand new technology that's going to save you, that's rather unlikely. And we know the technologies we're going to need. We know we're going to need carbon capture and storage. We know that we're going to need alternatives to aviation fuel. We know that we're going to need more electric vehicles, and therefore we need more electricity right the way across the piece. We know that our heating of our houses is going to have to be through something other than gas, and there are solutions such as heat pumps, such as potentially hydrogen, such as electricity. So we do know most of the technologies. Some of them are embryonic, some of them are more developed, and industry needs to scale those and needs to be given the incentives to do so. So there's a massive task for industry for mitigation, but also for adaptation. And then government is the third bit. And government must, of course, pull that innovation through. And the scaling of this is going to be a governmental challenge, and it needs big demonstrator test beds, things that people can actually try to see if they can get them at scale. It needs the ability to actually allow those companies that are doing this to grow into bigger companies, and it needs some risk, just as with the vaccines task force, where the approach was portfolio, because we knew things would fail. You need to be prepared to take risks. And by the way, just as in the COVID example, which was a resilience example, it was also a growth example. Companies are now interested in investing in the UK because the vaccines went well and they could see what the regulators and companies could do. It'll be the same here. Countries that do this well will get economic benefit as well as the benefit of making the climate better for the future generations. So what about government? Government, of course, needs to pull that through. It needs to integrate. It needs to be the place where this is pushed into practice. And there are some things that only government can do. So the fact that government has been funding nuclear fusion research, not fission, but fusion research for many, many years and continues to do so, is something that government ought to do. Because if fusion comes good, and it's looking more positive now than it's ever looked, that provides the energy source, the heat source that's going to be required, probably not for 2050, more like for 2060, 70, it starts to come online. But these are things that government only can do, although private companies are now beginning to get into that. So this is the other big challenge requiring all those three components. And it's worth reflecting that the WHO has described the climate change as the biggest health crisis facing humanity. And as with all health crises, and definitely was the case with the pandemic, guess who suffers the most? The answer, of course, is the poorest. And so the inequality that's going to be driven by this is potentially huge. The different organ systems affected are many, and you can see the list down the health outcomes at the bottom there. And we know extreme weather events, heat stress, air quality, water quality, food security, vector distribution, moving of malaria into different areas, for example, are all going to be important parts of what happens, and we need to be able to deal with it. And on the issue of extreme weather events, if you look at what's happened in Australia, and I was asking about wildfires a few years ago, and at the time I thought, well, this isn't a problem for the UK, but it's something that we probably just ought to know about. It is a problem for the UK now, and if you look at what's happened in Australia, wildfires have gone up linearly in the wildfire season, which is spring and summer. So you can see it going up in a straight line. What's happened, though, is it's gone up exponentially at the end of autumn and into winter. So the season has got longer, and the season now has an exponential increase in wildfires at the edges of where the normal season would be. So this is the huge challenge which governments face and absolutely requires scientists and, as I said, engineers. Why engineers? Because fundamentally, trying to fix this is a systems engineering problem. It requires people who can think back from 2050 and work out precisely how you would do this right the way across the nation. And that, I think, is an important part of government planning which needs to be in place. So that brings me back to what about government? What does government need to do? And I've made the case that this is a priority for all of government. It isn't actually the priority just for one department. It's something that every single government department needs to care about. And because it's every single department, it's a prime ministerial accountability. And that's why we suggested setting up a National Science and Technology Council chaired by the Prime Minister, which brought together secretaries of state across departments in order to make this as central to government action as, for example, the National Security Council is. Put this right at the heart of government, make it a prime ministerial accountability, make sure that any incoming prime minister on day one would want to see a file on the economy, a file on national security, and a file on science and technology, because it's so central to what they need to do. So that has been established. We set it up with the belief that it ought to be something that if a prime minister wished to stop it, they'd have to actively stop it and say, I don't care about it, which of course in a democratic process, that's perfectly reasonable, they can say that, but it has to be active, it can't be passive. And we set it up initially in end of 21, and it was getting into its stride when there was a rather abrupt change of government, and then it had a rather tumultuous 3 months, like many other parts of the country, and now it seems to be back into place. And I think this is something that Labour would keep as well. This is something that ought to be a civil service structure to drive this forward, with a process chaired by the Prime Minister. The second thing that's happened is now a department's been formed, Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. That isn't where all science and technology should take place, because it has to be in every department, but it is where those things which are cross-cutting and fundamental, how do we make sure that we've got the universities and the research funded properly? How do we make sure that there are incentives for companies to become S&T companies and grow them? How do we push to make sure that the skilled workforce is enabled to come to the UK in the right way? Those sorts of things are where Department for Science, Innovation and Technology really matters. And which are the technologies of the future that now need to be looked after before they become things that other departments would necessarily care about and companies start to look at. So whether that's quantum computing or engineering biology to change manufacturing. So this structure, I think, is important. A prime ministerially chaired committee and then a single department which focuses on those things that are specifically S&T, with every department worrying about S&T in general. And that leads me to my final slide, which is none of this is possible without the right people. And one of the lessons that I think is important right the way across any organisation, but is particularly important in something as difficult as science and technology, is that you don't achieve this if everyone comes from the same background, everyone has the same discipline, everyone has the same way of thinking, and everybody around the meeting agrees with each other because they've all got exactly the same set of experiences. So diversity, which is often seen as a sort of thing that you have to do on top of everything else, is fundamental to making this work. Because if we don't get a truly diverse workforce, and one only has to look at the figures for the number of women in engineering, which remains pitifully low, we've got to sort this out in order to make sure that we've got the real expertise and workforce and skilled people of the future who can work in a way that challenges the status quo and brings different minds to solving difficult problems. So I will finish there, and thank you very much for your attention.